Morning, everyone. Do you guys ever have moments where like, man, like how did I get here? And I don't mean in that really positive, like, oh man, I can't believe I got to this place. No, I mean like, do you ever just kind of wake up and not really know where you are? Like maybe you're traveling and all of a sudden you're in a hotel and you kind of forget for a minute as soon as you wake up, like where am I? I feel like this happens for my kids all the time. For those of you who have young kids, they'll like nod off while you're at dinner, and all of a sudden they wake up and it's like the next morning and they're in their own bed. And it's just like, how weird would that be for us as adults? Can you imagine like nodding off at work and all of a sudden you're in the Target parking lot? You're like, this is not upsetting at all. But like, just those moments of just, man, how did I get here? And the thing is like, those how did I get here moments, not in a literal sense, but in the kind of like, man, how did I get to this place right here? I feel like they usually come one of two ways. They're either completely unexpected, kind of like an earthquake, where everybody gets up the same morning thinking that everything's going to go on as normal, and then the disaster strikes and everything changes in an instant. Or the other way, those how did I get here moments, it's kind of like traveling through a fog, and you can't really see everything else around you until eventually it starts to dissipate and the distance becomes a lot clearer. Now for David, his how did I get here moment was a lot more like the second. So hey, let's read this and you'll understand a little bit more what I'm saying. It says in 1 Samuel 30, verse 1, David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day, and I'll explain what this means in a second. Now the Amalekites, who are not the good guys, had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag, and they had burned it. Now just understanding what we're reading, because we're hopping into an epic like right in the middle of it. That if you've been around church for a while, or if you have a rudimentary biblical knowledge, you would know that David is like a major character in the story of the Bible. That he kind of comes onto the scene in the book of 1 Samuel, and he's just this little shepherd boy, and there's another king in the land, but it's actually promised that he is going to get to be the next king of Israel. But it's kind of on the DL. And so he ends up actually becoming a confidant and a comforter to the king as he plays his harp for him and really calms the king's excited and depressed presence down. But then like the moment that most of us are kind of aware of is the moment when a young teenage David goes to battle. And this giant by the name of Goliath, who is threatening the entire Israelite army, is continually just speaking bad of the Israelites, their king, and their God, when David as a teenager steps up and he goes and he fights the giant and he kills him, and he becomes somewhat of a folk hero. But somewhere in the middle of David's story, before he becomes king and after he kills Goliath, you have this season of time where he is not living in Jerusalem, where you would expect to find somebody like him, but he's living in this town called Ziklag. And also to be understood is he's on the run from the king. The king of Israel starts to get word that this guy David is going to try and supplant me, and he's trying to kill David, even though David's not trying to take the throne forcefully. And so as David is out trying to run away from the king, he gathers this group of men, 600 to be exact. They're called his mighty men. They're his army that travel with him everywhere. And on this day, they're heading back to their home in Ziklag, all 601 of them. And they see it burning in the distance. And as they make it into the city, they look, and there is no one else. All of their wives, their children, any other tangential members of their city, they are not there. In fact, they have been captured. And it says in verse 2, and they had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but they carried them off as they went on their way. The potential for what is happening to the most prized relationships in their life has got to be devastating. The fact that they're not finding the bodies, that it's literally just vacant, has got to be worse, because your imagination of what could possibly be happening to these people that you love is disheartening, and it's sad, and it just crushes your spirit. I mean, just imagine if this were you. You would be sunk. And I know, like, just even with the little bit I give you, like, you're like, wait. Like, David, he's the giant killer. He is the one who, like, seems to go into every battle and win. He's the future king. How is this happening to him? And it says in verse 3, when David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives had been captured. Quick timeout. I get it. There's some polygamy going on here. Let me just address the elephant in the room, because some of you are like, I knew it. All right? Like, I'm getting that dating profile back up this afternoon. No. This is not an endorsement. It's an acknowledgement that it happened, not God's original plan, but it did occur. All right, it keeps going. It says, David's 2 wives had been captured, Ananiam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. And David is thinking, how did I get here? I'm not sure if any of you have ever woken up to a situation like this, where maybe you wake up one day and then you realize, my wife is on the verge of leaving me. Or maybe you go to work and you realize you're not getting away with it any longer, and your boss has finally severed the relationship and you're done. Or years and years of kind of neglect, and all of a sudden your kids and their lives are a mess. Or you just wake up one day and you just think, I do not like my life. I wish that everything was different. And you're unsure. How did I get here? Now, all this is even more dramatic if you know what leads up to it, because David's story starts off awesome. I mean, as a kid, he's promised he's going to get to be the future king of Israel. He's invited into the king's court to play his harp. He kills a giant at the age of 15. I mean, just imagine for a second if you found out that, like, pop star Harry Styles also is a member of, like, SEAL Team 6. I mean, this is like what we're talking about here. It's like if Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson had the voice of an angel. Like, this is the type of character that David is, that he has, like, this heart of an artist, but he also has, like, the bona fides that he is a great warrior, respected by all men. And he becomes this folk hero in Israel. They're writing songs about him and just his military conquests. But then his story takes a weird turn. Like I said, the king becomes jealous of David. And he starts trying to pursue him, trying to fight him and kill him. And David goes on the run. And what did he do to deserve this? Absolutely nothing. He's simply been successful. He's been faithful to God. He's been faithful to the king. And this following grows to 600 men around him. And in fact, it's actually while David is being hunted by King Saul that he's given the opportunity to kill him twice. Like, he could have taken the throne whenever he wanted, but he refuses to do it. And one of his motivations, like, who am I to lay hands on the king's anointed? That I believe that God has placed King Saul in leadership over me, and so why would I take this? Like, don't you just love and respect this guy? That he's got all the tools, he's got all the gifts, everybody loves him, and it just seems like every single step of the way he's making the right decision and doing the right thing. I mean, he's handling this fugitive thing really well. Now, we know how David's story ends, and so we don't always feel for him on that same level, but just imagine to be him for a second. You don't know exactly how this is all going to play out. And in fact, during that second time when David has the opportunity to kill Saul, and he doesn't, it seems to really move him. And Saul, the king, upon realizing, my life was spared by David, he seemingly repents. He says, who am I to, like, keep trying to pursue you? It looks like he's getting everything in order. But I don't know at what point it happened, but somewhere along the line, David started to question, maybe God is not going to continue to protect me. And it's with that little bit of doubt, a slow slide begins. It says in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 27, if you wanted to read this along with me. But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Now, let me explain this for a second. This is the wrong neighborhood to move into. And I actually think the very first mistake he made was he thought to himself. Because for many of us, we're convinced, I'm the smartest person. I know what I'm doing. I can take care of this on my own. But the reality is that often we are the common denominator in some of our worst decisions. I don't know if you've ever paid too much for something just to find out that you could have gotten it a lot cheaper somewhere else. You buy it in store just to look it up online. It was a third of the cost, right? You know what I'm saying? That is what David is about to go through. What does he want? He wants to stop running. He wants to stop trying to get away from the king. He wants to live at peace. And he's going to get what he wants. But the cost is going to be too high. Do you remember that giant that he fights, Goliath? Do you know where he's from? He's from this town called Gath, which is in the land of the Philistines. They would sing this song about David. And they would sing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Do you know who those tens of thousands were? The Philistines. And where is David moving his family, his 600 men, and their families? To the land of the Philistines. He's on his way to the wrong neighborhood. This is like the Israelites and the Philistines. That's like Yankees, Red Sox, Padres, Dodgers. It's Ali Frazier, Mario Bowser. This is a grouping that does not mix. David let the fears of his circumstances eclipse the faith in his God. And so now they're living in the land of the Philistines, and they're like, we've got to make a living. We've got to figure out how we're going to pull this all together. And so they start to take a poll. They're like, guys, we're going to have to cut out a living. We're going to have to find out how we're going to provide for ourselves. What are our marketable skills? Do we know construction? Does anybody here know design? Anybody know any lotions and soaps that they can sell to people? They're like, no, we don't do that. One person in the back pipes up, hey, I think we're really good at killing people. And there's all agreement, yeah, we're really good at killing people. So all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to kill people, but wait for money. So what they do is they decide, we're becoming mercenaries. And so what they do is they start to go into different areas where they feel like they can get away with it. They storm the city, kill everyone, and take the plunder back. In fact, this is what it says in verse 8 of 1 Samuel 27. Now, David and his men went up and they raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people had lived in the land extending to Shur in Egypt. And the best way to describe this is David is living in the land of the Philistines, and the nations that he's going and raiding and the cities he is destroying are not the Philistines, they're different. And those different nations, they're kind of an uneasy peace with the Philistines. If you know U.S. history, our relationship with the Soviet Union during the Second World War, where we're allies, but we're not necessarily friends, that would be the best way to describe those nations and the Philistines. That if word would get back to King Achish of the Philistines that David and his army is going and raiding these cities, it would create an international conflict. And so the way that David is solving this is in verse 9. It says, whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but he took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish, the king. And when they would stand in the king's presence, the king would ask, where did you get all this? And David's response was not, well, I'm going in and raiding some of your allies and taking all their stuff. No, he says, like, I'm going like south of Judah, and Judah was where he was from, the Israelites. And so what David is saying is technically correct. He was going south of Judah. Saying this knowing full well that the king is hearing, oh, he's going into South Judah. You guys can, like, do you see the conflict that's happening here? David is leading Achish to believe that he's raiding the Israelites. He's technically not lying because his words are communicating it's south of Judah, but it's intentionally misleading, and he's killing everybody with the intent to keep this under wraps. Just so you know, all because David is like this principal character in the Bible, he's not perfect. In fact, he makes tons of mistakes. And this is, once again, like the polygamy, not an endorsement, it's an acknowledgement that these things happened. And David's double life of trying to live as both an Israelite and in the land of the Philistines, it leads to compromise. Until eventually, while he's there living in the land of the Philistines, King Achish calls on him one day and says, David, we're going to war with the Israelites, and I need you. And at this point, David can't say no. He's sworn fealty to the king. This is his home now. So David and his army of 600, they pull all their swords and their arrows and their shields together, and they start making their way to the battlefront, to where they will be carrying the flag of the Philistine army, ready to storm into Israel and fight against the people that up until a year and a half prior, he had been living for, dying for, calling his home, and someday would be the future king of. This should have been David's very first how did I get here moment. This should have been the moment where he looked in the mirror and said, how did I go from being the future king of these people to taking up arms against him? And the only reason he doesn't actually go into battle is because when he arrives on the battlefront, the other allies of the Philistines, they call Achish over and they say, you're not going to actually let David fight with us, are you? And Achish's like, well, why? Like, he's been awesome. And his allies are like, no. Have you not heard the number one bestseller in Israel? Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Do you know who those tens of thousands were? Us. We are those tens of thousands. You can't possibly let him. And so Achish has to sheepishly go back to David and say, I am so sorry. You can't fight with us against your home people. Like, you got to go. And so David and his army, they start their slow walk, kind of dejected, from the battlefront back to Ziklag. And if he took an honest assessment of himself, he'd realize, like, I'm self-exiled. I've been living a double life. I've been rejected by my new kingdom. And here's the biggest one. He's been living far from God. And I know you're like, well, Matt, how do you really know? Like, maybe he's secret. No psalm had been written in the previous 16 months that he'd been living in Ziklag. And this is a pretty significant detail because David, if you really follow his story, from not just what was accounted for in the history of him, but if you read through the Psalms, David was the kind of guy who, in today's terms, would have put literally everything in his life on social media. Like, that was just that kind of guy, right? Like, everything that he was thinking, feeling. We have Psalms about almost every single stage and season of his life, with the exception of these 16 months where he leaves running from Saul in the wilderness to when he finally returns after this period of exile in Ziklag. It's all quiet. There is no accounting, which leads us to believe David was far from God during this whole season. I mean, Just read a few verses from Psalm 63 for me. Like, this is who this guy was up until this moment. He's like, "Oh God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you." He was writing this when he was in the wilderness, on the run from the king. "My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and gazed upon your power and glory. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. How I praise you. I will praise you as long as I live, lifting up my hands to you in prayer. You satisfy me more than the richest feast. I will praise you with the songs of joy." He just keeps going and going, just how incredibly important his relationship with God is, how he longs and he thirsts for God, how it's the most significant relationship that even when he's at his wit's end and he's on the run and he doesn't have hope for like another day because the king is coming down to try and kill him, and he doesn't know where he's going to sleep, and he's having to find his food out in the wilderness where nothing grows and nothing lives. God is the most important person in my life. It's the most important thing in my life. And in a moment of fatigue and exhaustion where he thinks, "I don't want to do this anymore. I'm tired of being on the run," he moves in with the Philistines, starts living a double life, starts murdering people and fielding all that they have for his own benefit until he eventually picks up the flag to walk and storm against his homeland. And he is silent with God the whole time. You know, some of the circumstances in your life that bring you the greatest pain are of no fault of your own. It's true. Like, you can't help it if your parents got divorced when you were a kid, and that created all sorts of baggage and problems later on. You can't help it if you were abused, assaulted, molested. Like, there's all sorts of things that can happen to you that bring great pain and heartache, not just in the moment, but throughout all of life. And I just want to be clear, those are the situations and circumstances I'm not talking about right now. But some of the greatest pain and difficult moments in your life have a common culprit: you. Because it is so easy for you to talk you into compromising. Because you know exactly what you want, and you know why you want it. And so it happens like, it's not always this, "Man, I'm going to wake up and do evil today, and I'm going to make my life a mess." No, it usually is a slow slide that if you're not watching it and if you're not paying attention, you will wake up one day wondering, how did I get here? So like, you're so scared of being alone. And so you know that he's not right for you. But like, I'm going to keep him around because it just feels like this is better than not having somebody. Even though he's terrible for you, he's mean to you, he's not godly, and he should be out of your life. You become loose with the truth because you fear of like being seen as a failure. And so it's a little compromise here, it's a little compromise there, take a little bit here, take a little bit there. Nobody will be none the wiser until all of a sudden you wake up one day and you're about to lose your job because you have made all of these small compromises. Trying to keep up appearances. You just make that purchase even though you can't really afford it. Then you make another purchase even though you can't really afford it. Until all of a sudden you wake up one day and you have a mountain of debt and you're like, "Man, how did this happen?" More often than not, the greatest moments in your life of pain and struggle have a common culprit. It's you. Now, what came first for David? Was it less time with God, or was it bad decisions? I don't know. In some ways, it doesn't matter. David's faith seemed to be greater when he was on the run, trying to get away from the king, but relying on God the whole time, than it was when he had controlled his situation so perfectly that he had gotten to a place where he was safe and he was rich and he was successful and he had the respect of his king for once. And in that moment, he was not close to God. Now, later in life, he would get both of those things again, but faith was significant. And here is the truth for us. Distance from God is the precursor and the constant to the most regrettable moments of your life. Jesus' brother James, he writes this in James 1. He says, "But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death." We are most drawn to things that appeal to us. And it's like, well, yeah, duh, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Of course, we're drawn to the things that appeal to us. What I'm trying to say is we're not going to be tempted to do the things that we don't want to do. Right? Like, most of you are probably not like, man, I just really want to I really want to sell some cocaine to children. Like, and I'm just going to go do, like, you probably don't want to do that. Is it a bad thing? Yeah. But like, that's not your temptation. It's the thing that it looks really good, it sounds really good, it appeals to us in so many different ways. Like you want to say yes to this. And frankly, maybe underneath some of these bad decisions, there's a righteous motivation. You know, we used the example before of, feeling alone. Yeah, is it a good thing to want to be with another person in your life? Absolutely. But can that desire for intimacy lead you to terrible decisions? Yeah. Does God want you to be successful or a failure? I would say God's cheering for you to be successful in life. Now, if success suddenly becomes this great goal and idol to where you're willing to compromise and ruin relationships in the process, no. That's usually the thing that we want. It appeals to us so greatly, and we just start making not big, bad decisions. We start making really small, bad decisions that just kind of start to compound over time until eventually things get bad. I mean, for David, he wanted to escape the lifestyle of running, but it cost him. And like a line from a credit card with a ballooning interest, the payments start to become unmanageable. And it just quickly gets out of hand. That David let the fears of his circumstances eclipse the faith in his God. Then he becomes loose with the truth when he's fearful of how other people are going to perceive him. And then several small compromises lead him to a situation where he was no longer just secretly living with the enemy, but now was trying to carry their flag into battle. And so as David and his men are heading back to Ziklag, they start seeing the smoke in the distance. And then denial starts to lead to acceptance. Because at first, like, well, man, that fire is a little out of hand. Eventually, they realize, like, no, that's more than just like a brush fire or something that caught fire in the distance. Like, no, that's our city. And they know this is their home. And when they get into Ziklag and they see that all of their wives and their children have been taken, it says that the men grab stones ready to kill David. And when David left the safety of God's wisdom, he opened himself up to disaster. I mean, if you really want to play with some thoughts, like, did God send the Amalekites to raid David's home? Actually, I don't think that's what happened. But did David position himself in a situation where it made it much more likely for something like this to happen? Absolutely. See, chances are, at some point in your life, maybe even right now, you have positioned yourself for impending disaster. You thought you could keep it a secret, but you can't, and now everything's on the rocks. You thought you could just take a little bit here and a little bit there. Nope, it's not working. You thought you could live on 110%, but it just finally caught up to you. You thought you could talk about your friends freely, but you found out that friend you're confiding in, their lips were not sealed, and now you're living in a relational backlash because of just all the things that you shouldn't have said, but you did anyway. Well, what should our responses be in these how did I get here moments? When the relationship's ready to collapse, when you burn those relational bridges, when your reputation and your identity is under siege? What should we do when sin takes us further than we want to go, keeps us longer than we want to stay, and costs us more than we want to pay? What do we do? It says in verse 6 of 1 Samuel 30, David was now in great danger because all his men were very bitter about losing their sons and their daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. But David found strength in the Lord his God. And here's what we do. When you reach the bottom, look up. Often we kind of think, yeah, I don't think I can bring this to God. Like, I've been on my own for so long, and he doesn't want to hear from me. He's so frustrated. No, when you reach the bottom, look up. Despite the fact that David had written all those Psalms, had been so important to all the parts of God, like, he hasn't had a conversation with him probably in like 16 months, except maybe on the side. But breaking those 16 months of silence, it says he finds the strength. He encourages himself. He finds the strength in the Lord his God. And for you, your past does not need to determine your future. You've been in a season of time where like God has been completely sidelined in your life. At one point, very real, very good relationship, not recently. And all the problems and the frustrations you're going through are not actually related to like a faithful and good walk with God, but kind of like your own mistakes and problems. And you're thinking like, I need to keep distance. I need to like get myself in order. I need to clean myself up before God will have me back. No. When you reach the bottom, look up. See, when Christ goes to the cross and he allows the nails to be put through his hands and through his feet, when he allowed the crown of thorns to be placed on his head, when he took the beatings and the scourgings, he didn't do that so that, like, you know what, like, you get yourself kind of a little bit better and then we'll talk about this. No, he did this because he knew you're going to run towards the things that you shouldn't all the time. That you can't get out of your own way. That you're going to make a lot of small compromises, and several of those small compromises are going to lead to bigger compromises. But in spite of all of that, you were forgiven, and you were invited into a relationship with him. And that he just desperately wants you to know, all right, so you've gotten to the bottom, look up. I don't want to be your parents' God. I don't want to be your nation's God. I want to be your God. And so let's talk. Let me help you, not just eternally bring you into a right relationship, because he does that, and he's offering you forgiveness for your past, your present, and your future. But also, let me help you get out of this situation. And that doesn't mean necessarily that everything's going to be restored, like what happens for David. Sometimes that means we have to live in the mess that we've created, but I will be with you and I will walk alongside you the entirety of that restoration period. That when you reach the bottom, I just want you to look up. And I think that maturity for us as followers of Jesus is realizing that when we go through those how did I get here moments, it's not God's cruelty to allow you to go through pain. It's actually can be God's goodness to wake you up and to bring you back into a place of I'm relying on him and I'm not trying to get it all figured out on my own any longer. But then eventual maturity gives us the tools and the abilities to recognize these small compromises are going to lead to something much worse, and I need to put it to death right here and right now. And through the power of Christ and through the power of Jesus, we can have freedom over our sin so that we stop falling back into those same old habits and patterns again. His love for you is greater than you can imagine. His mercy is broader for you than you could ever possibly comprehend. His grace is better than you can fathom. And he's inviting you to look up. And so for David, he finds strength in the Lord his God. And he resolves, we're going to go back, and he grabs his man and says, I know you want to kill me, but trust me this one last time. And God tells him, go after, you're going to get him. So they go after the Amalekites, and they actually bring their women and their children back. Eventually, in that battle that they were going to fight in, the king Saul is killed. Israel's now looking for a new king. Through a series of events, David becomes a king, eventually leading to him restoring the kingdom of Israel. And some of you might be thinking, well, that's not fair. Look at all the mistakes he made. And frankly, that is the story of the gospel. It is not fair for us to be accepted and brought back and put into positions of honor and prestige, but God does that for us anyway. His grace is more than we can imagine. The plan he has for you is so much bigger and better. But get out of your own way. Look to him and look up. Let's pray. God, you are a God who loves us. You are a God who puts us in positions of prestige that we do not deserve. But God, I pray that we wouldn't flaunt that we wouldn't throw that into your face, God, that you forgive us for things that we do to hurt you and hurt ourselves. But God, rather, you would use your grace and your kindness to lead us to repentance so that we could get the pain out of our lives, that God, that we would confess of our sin and that we would move past it and we would see that you are a God who wants to restore us and redeem us. So God, I pray for this crowd right here. But God, I'm asking that as they take an honest assessment of just where they're at in life, for those who've been trying to do life on their own, that you would just speak to them right now through your Holy Spirit, that you want a relationship, God, and that you are calling them to say, I'm asking you to forgive me my sins and take full control of my life for the very first time. That God, for others who said, yeah, I have a relationship with you, God, but it's just been on the rocks and it's been quiet and silent, that God, that today would be the day where they look up and they would change their perspective. And that God, you would bring them back into a good and right relationship with you. And God, lastly, I'm praying for us to be able to see just so much more clearly how your grace has impacted our everyday, that we would live in this reality that you are a God who positions us and places us where we shouldn't belong, but in the best of ways. And that we would become so much more in awe of your grace and your mercy and your goodness. And I pray in your Son, Jesus' name, amen.